there is any indication lawmakers at the State House are advancing bills at the State House a vast majority of Idahoans don't seem to really want, well, that ESA bill would be a prime example of that. And that bill, as well as several others, are getting noticed and prompting viewer questions like this one that was sent in to us after seeing that a bill has been introduced to make administering a COVID vaccine a misdemeanor. I'm wondering what legitimate bills are being introduced, if any, asks Gaga M. Well, that's a great question, Gaga, and one we've heard a few times over the last couple of weeks. To address this, we thought we would look at what might be a legitimate bill. For the last 8 years, Boise State University has put out an Idaho public policy survey. They do this during a week in mid-November when they ask about 1,000 adults, exactly 1,000 adults from 43 of Idaho's 44 counties. They ask them some questions. It's intended to track Idahoans' opinions of the direction of the state and what they view to be important issues being handled at the State House. We've talked about these things when the results came out a couple weeks ago, actually. And what we learned then, when it comes to the direction of the state, well, it's about 50-50. Those who think the state is headed in the right direction, that's at 44%. Those who think the state is headed in the wrong direction, about 41%. Given the plus-minus of the 3%, it's pretty even. For the first time in the 8-year history of the survey, those numbers are that close. Republican men were more optimistic than Democratic women, believe it or not. When the survey wanted to know about the Idaho legislature, though, it asked people to rate what they feel would be important topics to tackle during the upcoming legislative session. They gave them prompts and asked them, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all important and 10 being extremely important, where should lawmakers focus their attention? So these are where most people rated these topics in the 8 to 10 range of their survey. Education, 72% of them said, yeah, I'd rate that higher than 8, or around the 8 to 10 range. Jobs and economy, 64%. Housing, 61%. Healthcare, 60% of those surveyed. Taxes, 54% of those surveyed say, yeah, it's pretty important. Environment, 51.5%, and transportation, 42%. So that kind of rounds out where you see where those ideas lie. So we took a look at the bills that have been introduced so far at the Idaho State House on this 38th day of the session. And so far, we've had 266 bills brought forward. Unless something's come through in the last hour and a half or so, that is our number. That's in both chambers, 159 in the House, 107 in the Senate. We tried to break them down as best we could by category. If it had anything to do with education, from teacher apprenticeships to medical school agreements to the Idaho Launch Program, and so far there have been 19 education bills introduced at the State House, including that ESA bill, which would actually move money away from public schools. Jobs and economy, just 9 bills. Housing, none that have to do directly with housing, even though 61% of Idahoans think it should be very important to lawmakers. Healthcare, 23 bills so far, including 1 in the House to repeal Medicaid expansion. Taxes, there have been 19 bills in the House, 5 in the Senate. Only 1 of those has to do with property taxes, though, in the Senate. 6 of them have to do with property taxes in the House, and there's just 1 from the House to repeal the grocery tax. How about the environment? Well, more than half of those surveyed said it was a pretty big deal. There are just 4 bills in both chambers that reference that topic. 3 of them have to do with water. Transportation, well, there are quite a few bills in the State House that have to do with that. 22 in the House, 11 in the Senate, for a total of 33. Now, they're not all about infrastructure, though. A majority of them have to do with, like, driving rules, who can teach driving, and license plates. So they're pretty widespread. That's how current bills connect to the survey list put out by BSU. As for the outside of that list, there are 15 bills that have to do with elections, 2 that have to do with militias, and 1 that has to do with raw milk. Just a side note. But it's interesting, as Lady Gaga there alluded to, there's a lot of bills coming from a category we called and titled, for no other reason than just to call it this, morality signaling. Having something to do with a moral issue. That would be like abortion or withholding funding from cities who don't prioritize prosecuting abortions. Anything LGBTQ, like bathrooms or transgender minors, to be specific. There are bills about vaccines and the COVID pandemic. Those militias we mentioned, that's in there. Marriage licenses and bills having to do with child protective services, something that seems to be important in this post-Baby Cyrus Idaho. There's a lot of them. 21 of those from the Senate side. From adding the words sexual orientation and gender equity to the Idaho Human Rights Act, to a bill preventing vaccines from popping up in our food, which isn't really happening in Idaho. Worth mentioning, that bill and 12 others of those Senate bills are sponsored by members of the Freedom Caucus. That's the Freedom Caucus, self-described. 6 of them came from Republican Senator Scott Herndon alone. On the House side, there are 13 what we call moral signaling suggestions, including 1 introduced yesterday by Senator Tammy Nichols about making anyone who gives an mRNA vaccine like a COVID vaccine, they want to make that a misdemeanor. So yes, Gaga, so far the bills that fall into this category and well outside the parameters of what Idahoans feel are important issues, a lot of them outnumber the bills many of us would consider hot topics for lawmakers to be talking about.